In the annals of history, there exist moments of staggering consequence that hinge not on action, but on paralysis, not on courage, but on its absence, not on the fatal bullet fired, but on the one deliberately withheld. This is the story of such a moment that would echo through 70 million deaths, the wholesale industrialization of genocide, the obliteration of entire civilizations, all stemming from a single decision made in the presence of absolute power by a man whose identity remained obscured by the machinery of history itself. To understand this paradox, we must first situate ourselves within the psychological and political landscape of Nazi Germany during the twilight years of the Third Reich. By 1944, the Nazi war machine had begun its inevitable contraction. The Eastern Front hemorrhaged men and resources. Soviet forces advanced relentlessly westward. The strategic bombing campaign reduced German cities to rubble and ash. Yet Hitler remained, impossibly, still standing, still issuing orders from his fortified bunker, still commanding the apparatus of state terror, still wielding absolute dominion over a nation utterly enslaved to his vision. Within this context of collapse, a particular category of individuals inhabited a unique psychological and spatial proximity to power. These were the functionaries, the adjutants, the minor officials who existed in the perpetual shadow of the Führer. They were close enough to observe his deteriorating mental state, the tremors, the rages, the morphine-induced stupors that increasingly characterized his existence. They were close enough to recognize that the man they served had become a husk, animated only by rage and pharmaceutical intervention. And crucially, they were close enough to act. The man in question, let us call him a representative of this category, occupied a position of modest but genuine access. He was neither a general with independent command authority, nor a lowly functionary utterly powerless before the machinery of state. He existed in that deadly middle ground, sufficiently elevated to move within Hitler's immediate orbit, yet sufficiently junior to remain beneath the obsessive notice of the Gestapo's paranoid apparatus. He had passed through the rigorous screening processes that governed admission to the Führer's presence. He had taken the oaths. He had submitted to the ideological conditioning. He had, by the time our narrative begins, become absolutely embedded within the machinery of Nazi power. What distinguished this individual, however, was something far more dangerous than explicit disloyalty. He possessed what might be termed selective disillusionment. He had not rejected Nazism wholesale. He had not undergone some dramatic moral awakening. Rather, he had arrived, through a combination of observation, proximity, and the inexorable logic of events, at a devastating recognition. The system he served was not merely committing atrocities, it was committing them while losing. The racial paradise promised by Nazi ideology was proving to be a mirage. The 1,000-year Reich would not survive another year. And the man at the center, the figure who had been elevated to near godhood by the apparatus of propaganda, had revealed himself to be fundamentally human, fallible, deteriorating, mad. In this context of disillusionment without rupture, opportunity presented itself. The specific mechanics of this opportunity remain partially obscured by the fog of historical documentation and the deliberate destruction of records that characterized the Nazi regime's final days. But the contours are clear enough. There existed a moment, a configuration of circumstances, in which our protagonist found himself in the immediate physical presence of Hitler, in circumstances in which an act of violence would have been feasible. Whether such an act would have succeeded in killing the Führer, whether Hitler's bodyguards, his food tasters, his pervasive security apparatus would have detected and neutralized the threat, becomes almost immaterial. What matters is that the opportunity existed, that it was perceived, and that a conscious decision was made not to act upon it. This moment of non-action stands as perhaps the most historically consequential instance of human paralysis ever documented. For in that moment, a man held the potential future of Europe, the lives of millions of men, women, and children not yet born, in his hands, and he released it. He allowed it to slip away. He chose the safety of continued service over the terrible risk of assassination. And in that choice, he became complicit, retroactively, in every atrocity that would follow. The question that haunts this narrative, the question that transforms it from mere historical anecdote into a meditation on human nature, moral agency, and the terrible weight of consequence, is deceptively simple. Why?
Why did he not act? What psychological, emotional, or rational calculus led a man with access and opportunity to choose inaction? To understand this, we must examine not merely the external circumstances of the moment, but the internal landscape of a mind conditioned by years of totalitarian service, by fear both conscious and unconscious, by the seductive comfort of obedience, and by the horrifying recognition that killing Hitler, even to save millions, required becoming something irredeemable oneself.
To comprehend the labyrinth of institutional conditioning that produced such paralysis, we must examine the biographical architecture of our protagonist, the accumulated experiences, loyalties, and deformations of character that had shaped him into the precise instrument of ambivalence he had become by 1944. His trajectory was, in many respects, unremarkable within the context of Nazi Germany's machinery of co-option. He had not been born a true believer in the racial mysticism that formed the ideological bedrock of Nazism. Rather, he had been conscripted into belief through the systematic mechanisms of institutional capture that characterized the Nazi state. Like so many functionaries who inhabited the apparatus of totalitarian power, his initial engagement with the regime had been pragmatic rather than ideological. He had been young during the seizure of power. He had possessed education, linguistic skills, and an administrative competence that marked him as potentially useful to the machinery of state. The Nazi regime, despite its totalitarian pretensions, required precisely such individuals, bureaucrats, technicians, military officers, who could manage the vast machinery of governance and violence without necessarily being consumed by the quasi-religious fervor that animated the regime's ideological core. He had been drafted into service because he was useful, and he had remained in service because the alternative, refusal, dissent, withdrawal, carried penalties so severe as to render them unthinkable for a man with family, with dependents, with the ordinary human attachments that bound individuals to survival. Years of proximity to power created a peculiar distortion of perspective. He observed the machinery of governance from within. He understood, as few could, the profound banality underlying the regime's most spectacular barbarisms. The genocide was not conducted in moments of ecstatic frenzy, but through memoranda, administrative procedures, bureaucratic correspondence. The machinery of death was, in its operational essence, remarkably mundane. This understanding that absolute evil could be perpetrated through perfectly ordinary procedures by perfectly ordinary men produced in him not moral revulsion, but a kind of existential vertigo. How could one condemn a system when one was so thoroughly embedded within it? How could one claim moral purity from a position that was, by definition, complicit? Yet something else was occurring simultaneously within the psychological landscape of the Reich. By the final years of the war, a particular phenomenon had begun to manifest among those closest to Hitler, a recognition of the Führer's fundamental degradation. The man whom propaganda had elevated to near-divine status had become visibly, undeniably human in his frailty. The tremors in his hand intensified, his rages became more unpredictable, his strategic decisions became increasingly detached from military reality. He would issue orders for counteroffensives that had no possibility of success, moving phantom divisions on maps, issuing commands to forces that no longer existed. And those who served him, who had built their entire careers, their entire sense of self within the architecture of absolute obedience to this figure, confronted an unbearable cognitive dissonance. The question of assassination was not entirely absent from the discourse of the Reich's inner circles during these final years. The July 20 plot of 1944, the Valkyrie conspiracy, had demonstrated that even among high-ranking military figures, the possibility of removing Hitler through violent means had been contemplated, planned, and nearly executed. That operation had failed spectacularly, resulting in the execution of hundreds of conspirators, the destruction of their families, and a renewed intensification of Hitler's paranoia and his grip on power. These events had occurred in close temporal and spatial proximity to the moment of our narrative. They had created an atmosphere of terror and suspicion that permeated even the most senior ranks of the Nazi state. For a man in our protagonist's position, neither high enough to be a principal architect of resistance, nor low enough to be safely ignorant, the lessons of Valkyrie were unambiguous. Any act against the Führer would not be surgical removal followed by orderly transition. It would be catastrophic failure, followed by torture, followed by execution, followed by the destruction of one's entire family as punishment for the crime of disloyalty.
The Nazi state had perfected the mechanics of collective punishment. Entire families had been systematically destroyed to punish a single member's act of resistance. This was not theoretical, it was documented, notorious, widely known. Moreover, there existed a peculiar psychological defense mechanism that had come to characterize those within the Nazi apparatus by this late stage of the war. A kind of fatalistic resignation had settled over many functionaries, a recognition that the Reich was doomed, that catastrophe was inevitable, coupled with a simultaneous inability to act upon this recognition. If Germany was going to lose the war regardless, if the entire ideological edifice was about to be swept away by history, then perhaps it was safer, more prudent to remain passive, to not cast one's fate further into jeopardy, to wait, to survive, to hope that one might emerge from the wreckage of the Third Reich with one's life and one's family intact. In this calculus of desperation and fear, the death of Hitler became almost irrelevant. The machinery was already in motion. Stopping it would require more than the removal of one man, however symbolically that removal might be.
The moment itself arrived not as a dramatic crescendo, but as a peculiar convergence of mundane circumstance and opportunity, the kind of historical juncture that passes unnoticed in real time, acquiring significance only in retrospect, only after the branching paths of history have made clear what might have been. Our protagonist found himself in the immediate physical presence of Hitler, under circumstances that rendered the Führer unusually vulnerable. The specific mechanics of this vulnerability, whether it emerged from a lapse in security protocols, from the deliberate positioning of certain individuals within the space, or from the simple entropy of a decaying system struggling to maintain its paranoid apparatus, remain partially obscured by the fog of memory and the deliberate destruction of documentation that characterized the Nazi regime's final days. What is clear, however, is that the moment possessed a certain crystalline quality of possibility. The requisite elements were present. He possessed the means, whether through access to poison, to a concealed weapon, or to the simple physical proximity that might allow for a knife thrust before security personnel could intervene. He possessed the knowledge, an understanding of Hitler's routines, his vulnerabilities, his moments of distraction or pharmaceutical haze. He possessed the motive, not moral outrage in its pure form, but rather a corrosive recognition that the entire system was collapsing, that the man at its apex was no longer rational, and that the perpetuity of his rule could only produce infinite additional suffering. And he possessed something else, perhaps more crucial. He possessed the plausible deniability that could theoretically allow him to survive the immediate aftermath. In that moment, the internal architecture of his consciousness must have undergone a profound reconfiguration. The theoretical question, what would you do if you could kill Hitler, had transmuted into lived reality. The abstraction had become concrete. The hypothetical had become present. And with that transformation came a cascade of considerations that operated simultaneously at multiple psychological registers. There was the immediate calculation of personal survival. Would the assassination succeed? Would he be detected? Could he escape? Could he hide? Could he survive the inevitable reprisals? There was the consideration of efficacy. Would killing Hitler at this stage genuinely alter the trajectory of the war, or would it simply accelerate the regime's dissolution without preventing the catastrophes already in motion? There was the question of moral agency. Was he in fact a murderer if he carried out this act, or was he something else, a liberator, an avenger, a participant in historical necessity? But underlying all these rational calculations was something more fundamental, the sheer weight of institutional gravity that bound him to obedience. He had spent years, formative, character-shaping years, within a system that had systematized the suppression of autonomous will. Every institution he had inhabited, every hierarchy he had navigated, had inculcated in him the principle that disobedience was not merely dangerous but morally incoherent. To act against Hitler was not simply to commit murder, it was to repudiate the entire framework of meaning within which he had constructed his identity, his career, his sense of purpose. To pull the trigger, to administer the poison, to drive the blade was to become, in the logic of the regime that had shaped him, a traitor, not merely to a leader, but to the entire apparatus of order that had been represented as synonymous with civilization itself. And there was another factor, perhaps the most psychologically determinative. The question of efficacy was genuinely uncertain. The strategic situation was deteriorating, but it was not yet entirely hopeless in the eyes of Hitler and his most dedicated followers. There remained, however tenuous, the possibility that some miraculous reversal might yet save the Reich, that new weapons would emerge, that alliances would fracture, that the Soviet advance could be halted. In this context,
Killing Hitler would be not a final blow against a doomed system, but a betrayal of a leader who still commanded millions of soldiers, still possessed vast destructive capacities, still might yet produce consequences that would dwarf the consequences of premature action. The moment passed. The decision, or perhaps more accurately, the failure to decide, crystallized into action through inaction. He did not raise his hand. He did not administer the poison. He did not strike. He remained in place, in a posture of service, in his assigned role within the architecture of power. And in that moment of non-action, something shifted fundamentally in the trajectory of history. The opportunity closed. The contingency resolved itself into inevitability. The man who could have killed Hitler chose not to, and in that choice, he became not a savior but a witness, complicit through passivity, condemned through inaction to bear the psychological weight of roads not taken. What followed was perhaps the cruelest dimension of this trajectory, the subsequent intensification of Hitler's paranoia, the tightening of security, the elimination of any remaining access points. The moment of vulnerability sealed itself off, replaced by ever more elaborate systems of surveillance and control. The Führer, sensing perhaps the vulnerability that his own deterioration had created, constructed ever more impenetrable barriers between himself and the world, and our protagonist was left with the unbearable knowledge that he had possessed, in his hands, the capacity to alter history, and had voluntarily relinquished it.
The denouement of this narrative, the final chapters of both our protagonist and the system he served, unfolded with an inexorable logic that seemed, in retrospect, entirely predetermined. Yet it was not. The contingency that had existed in that moment of opportunity had been real. The branching path toward an alternative history had been genuinely available. The man who could have killed Hitler would live to witness the consequences of his refusal, and those consequences would be written in the obliteration of cities, the incineration of millions, and the permanent scarring of human civilization. Hitler's final weeks were characterized by an escalation of paranoia that transcended even the pathological standards of his earlier years. Encased within the concrete tomb of his bunker, surrounded by dwindling loyalists and increasingly erratic in his command decisions, the Führer descended into a state of psychological dissolution that bordered on the operatic in its tragedy. The deterioration was not gradual but precipitous. By April 1945, he had become a figure more phantom than substance, a voice issuing orders to forces that no longer existed, a will attempting to impose itself upon a reality that had fundamentally rejected it. His physiology was a landscape of collapse, tremors, vision problems, the visible toll of decades of substance abuse and stress. And yet the apparatus of power, remarkably, persisted in its obedience, even as it became increasingly clear that obedience served no rational purpose. Our protagonist, by this final period, had become something approaching a ghost within the bunker itself. The very proximity that had once marked him as potentially useful had become a liability. The intensification of security, the ever-narrowing circle of those permitted near the Führer, had begun to exclude him from the inner sanctum. He found himself relegated to peripheral roles, observing the endgame from a distance that was simultaneously physical and psychological. And in that periphery, he was forced to confront the full weight of his earlier choice. The question that would haunt him for the remainder of his life, assuming he survived at all, a proposition that remained uncertain even as the Nazi state entered its final days, was deceptively straightforward in its formulation. How many deaths would have been prevented had he acted? The historians, working backward from the vantage point of post-war analysis, would offer staggering numbers. Millions of Soviet soldiers who perished in the final offensives, tens of thousands of civilians incinerated in the final firebombing campaigns, the acceleration of the Holocaust in its final, most intensive phase, the cascade of desperate, destructive decisions that flowed from Hitler's psychological state as the system he had constructed began its violent collapse. An earlier death for the Führer might have shortened the war by weeks or months, thereby preventing incalculable suffering. Yet this calculation, however mathematically compelling, operates under the assumption of a degree of historical determinism that is itself questionable. Would the assassination of Hitler in 1944 or 1945 have genuinely altered the strategic trajectory of the war, or would it have merely accelerated certain outcomes while postponing others? Would the Nazi state have fragmented into competing power centers, or would some successor figure have emerged to consolidate control? Would the Soviet advance have been halted, or would it merely have proceeded unobstructed by German resistance? These are questions not of morality but of historical contingency, and contingency by its very nature resists definitive resolution. What remains beyond question, however, is the psychological trajectory of the man who could have acted but did not. The post-war records, fragmentary, incomplete, often contradictory, suggest a figure consumed by a particular form of existential guilt. Not the explicit guilt of one who murders, but the far more subtle and psychologically corrosive guilt of one who had possessed the power to prevent catastrophe and had voluntarily surrendered it. He survived the war, though the specifics of his escape and subsequent fate remain obscured by the documentary record.
He lived into the post-war period, presumably carrying within him the weight of his inaction. The ultimate irony, the bitter coda that history appends to this narrative, is that Hitler did not die by assassination. He died by suicide in the bunker as the Red Army closed in and the game had become obviously lost. He died by his own hand, in the company of his new bride, in an act that was simultaneously an escape and a final assertion of will. And in that death, rendered inevitable by military collapse rather than human agency, the historical contingency that had once existed crystallized into irrevocable fact. The moment had passed. The opportunity had closed. The alternative history that might have emerged from a different choice had been sealed off, inaccessible forever. What remains is only the meditation on might have been, on the terrible weight of inaction, on the fragility of human agency within the machinery of historical forces, and on the recognition that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not those we commit, but those we fail to prevent. The man who could have killed Hitler returned to a world that would struggle, for generations, to comprehend how such an evil had been possible, how such devastation could have been permitted to unfold, and he carried within him, unto his death, the unbearable knowledge that he had possessed in his hands, the capacity to alter that history, and had chosen to let it pass.